Good morning, everybody. Are we live? We're live. Excellent. Hello, everybody. So I write a lot of blogs about game design, but I thought they say video is king, and it's a way to get out of my comfort zone a little bit and talk directly to people. So I'm reading this book. It's a really good book. It's very small and short, really worth reading. At first, I thought, oh, this is for beginners. I understand how games are important cultural, psychological artifacts that create empathy rather than sympathy in people because they're participatory. But what I wasn't expecting is that this book really challenges you to make personal responses. There's an amazing quote early on that says, the only way to communicate with other people is through yourself. And I'm someone who doesn't actually like to look at myself. That's part of my disability and part of my trauma. I really am frightened of thinking about myself, thinking about the things I think, thinking about who I am and how to communicate. It's also because I'm autistic. I've learned that the best way to get through life is just to be whoever somebody wants me to be. And as a result, I suffer from what was called depersonalization a lot, where I am so busy pretending to be things, I have no idea who I am. And that's going to sound very odd if you don't know how that works, but that's what happens to me all the time. And I think this might be why a lot of people who are autistic are more often highly represented as being gender fluid or agender or all sorts of things like that, because those feel like, to me anyway, external things that are put onto me by the outside world. So why would I have an opinion on them? And um, you know, in that sense, I sort of identify with being agender, but I also look down and go, well, I seem to be man shaped. So that's probably what I am. And I think that's also just how I view the universe. I'm a very sort of reactive person. I look at what is there and I just try to go, well, that's what's going on. But as I say, even though I have a very, very deep internal life, I do suffer a lot from depersonalization, and de-actualization and derealization, where so derealization is sort of the opposite, where I have such an internal response to everything. I have trouble understanding that the real world is actually physical and real and important. I'm basically constantly living in Plato's cave. Given that everything is filtered through my experience, I can't trust my senses a lot of the time. There's a quote in one of my games where I talk about angels being able to feel with their fingertips, but not feel where their fingers end. And that's how I feel all the time. I feel like there's a barrier between my cognition that doesn't reach the end of my fingers. And I don't understand how to connect the internal with the external. So as part of that, I'm trying to be more on camera, so that I'm not using written expression, because I'm very different between those two modes. So I'm not going to script these. I'm going to talk straight to the camera. I'm going to see what happens. It's probably like all my other videos. It'll get mostly ignored, but it's an exercise in me representing myself to you as a game designer. And I'm going to be doing this more often, once a week. Expect videos like this on my YouTube channel. We'll see if we can grow that as well. Blogs will also be still coming out on my blog. But we're going to start these videos with exercises. This excellent book, Empathy Engines, has a challenge at the end of every chapter to make a game, to design a game that is about representing political or personal systems that you struggle with. The first chapter is called Systems Make Statements. And it's explaining that very much you cannot be neutral when you create a system. It just doesn't work like that. You are always choosing what you represent and how. And it uses the example of SimCity, where they claim to be neutral, but they are actually creating a world where race doesn't exist, where the racial prejudice is invisible, and where it runs on some fairly right-wing sort of politics, or not necessarily like right-wing in terms of what we often think is bigotry, but financial systems. If you raise taxes, people are instantly unhappy, and it tends to make all businesses flee. And there are things like that that are that are very much built in from the politics of Will Wright, who designed the first game. Taxes are very bad, and it hurts you, and they hurt your city. And now SimCity has added a few small things that have expanded that thing, and of course, immediately attracted attacks of being woke. Um, although that's just, of course, for haymaking by the far right, of course, to make you think that everything is woke. For example, one of the terrible things it has is that the cities have um, government programs like police and fire and ambulance, and that is attacked by some readers as like, oh no, this is a socialist, nightmare world, because if you commit a crime, the police come and arrest you and put you in jail, because that is how, of course, conservatives uh, antagonists are sort of trying to attack the world. But the challenge in this first chapter one, is to make a game about redlining. Now, redlining is something that is very important, but it's something that is uniquely American. And as such, I'm another step removed from it. Not just am I white, but I'm also in Australia. And so I didn't think I should make a game about redlining because I just don't have as much connection to that. So I immediately thought about the race issues we have in Australia. The Indigenous people of Australia are sometimes very dark skinned, but either way, there is a huge amount of cultural and pigmentary racism towards the Australian Indigenous population, the Aboriginal people. We use that as an adjective, not as a noun. And of course, that is a very large group of people with a lot of different cultures and things across them. But one thing that, of course, is very, very destructive is that European culture, when it came to this world, had a very, very different view about how to use the land and how to control the land. Most of the European settlers in Australia came from England and Ireland. They were prisoners, and they were coming about during the period of the Bloody Code and the seizing of the commons. So during the 19th century, the 18th and early 19th centuries, there was a great shift in control of land at the very beginning of the agrarian revolution. Basically, landlords came into power, and as the sort of markets grew, everything became very important to control who controlled which land, and common land, where everyone could share large areas of woodland and grassland to graze and to forest and to gather things, suddenly became fenced land that belonged entirely to the lord of the manor, and he could control with force who could come on to his land. And this caused, for example, most butchers to go out of business entirely. It just wasn't able for them to make money because they couldn't graze animals on the common for free anymore. A third of all highwaymen in Britain and Ireland were butchers, because that industry just went. And a lot of people who came to Australia were butchers, were farmers, were graziers, who were sort of on the run from this system, or they were people who were forced into the cities by these movements and then forced to into poverty and so on. But they were coming from a world that was very much about drawing square lines on a map, giving you a plot of land that belonged to you, and that you had to work to provide value, and then you would put things in a cart and you would run it to market, and then you would sell it and you would take your cart back, and it was all very rectilinear and it was all very sectioned off. And when they came to Australia, that, of course, culture doesn't exist among the Indigenous people here, who are very much... Now, there is, in some cases, this is, again, very blanket, they were more of a nomadic people, more of a collecting people. They were able to draw resources without hyper-dense farming or domestication of cattle or anything like that. And that meant that they had a very long range, sometimes, of connection between peoples, a connection between themselves and the land. They would walk long distances in circles and cycles, returning to periods, places of land at different times to harvest different resources. and that way we're able to you know allow allow cycles of the land to take place, and so forth and so on. So they often had quite a large area that they would exist in, and their society depended a lot on being able to move large distances. And very quickly, the European method of "we own this land" came directly in conflict with that. And by the time Governor Macquarie arrived in the 1820s of Sydney, that was the key battleground, um, because the Europeans had this very fixed idea of, no, this is our bit, you can have that bit, and they thought they'd explained that. And the indigenous people were like, that doesn't make any sense. Nobody owns land. We move across it with a responsibility to land and a connection to land to get what we need, and nobody puts up fences, except natural barriers. For example, like we might be like, you guys have one side of the river, we'll have the other side of the river. There are things like that that did exist in their culture. I'm not really representing it as particularly well as I could. So that made me instantly think of, what's a simple way to express how difficult it becomes to do something once people start drawing lines. And so, easy way to represent this, a nice abstract way to do it, is to simply play a game of throw the ball, throw and catch. So imagine you're all standing out in a field and you're throwing a ball to each other. The ball's allowed to bounce, but if it rolls on the ground before you catch it, you're out. The aim of the game is to pass the ball without that happening among the whole group. So 2 to 4 players, 2 to X players passing the ball around, and then you're going to take some steps back, and you'll see that in a nice open field, even with a few trees and things like that, even if you're moving, it's actually pretty easy to pass the ball around when there's no straight lines. And then go and play it in a street, go and play it in a city, go and play it when there's lots of people walking around, play it in a crowded supermarket. Suddenly, there's lines everywhere. It's really, really hard to move that ball around between people. It doesn't matter how big a gap, it doesn't matter how close you are to each other. You can't get around corners. You can't see each other. The ball's going to get knocked out of your hand, and people are just going to keep crossing where you are. Now, if you play this in the middle of rush hour in a busy mall, it's much, much harder, and people are going to shout at you and get angry at you when all you're trying to do is pass the ball. They're going to knock the ball out of your hands. They're going to tell you to stop playing that game. It's a simple way to just get an empathy situation going. As soon as you interrupt your process, which is passing things around, by people who don't want to do that process, it becomes so much harder. And what do you do in response? You tend to get much closer. And one of the problems we've had with trying to give Indigenous people housing in Australia is that there's often issues of overcrowding. But that's because Indigenous people are often used to having a lot of communication between communities. And when those things were cut off, the best response for that was to come together. So yes, if you give an Indigenous person a family a house, they might get all their relatives to come and live there as well, because their whole culture has been cut off from communication. So they need to have these people close so they can keep passing that ball, because they have an experience over the last 200 years of being absolutely cut off by this arbitrary system that just doesn't recognize their system of communication and movement. Anyway, that's a simple idea that you could use to teach that sort of thing, is to just have some kids do that. You can do it on an oval, and then you can have all the other kids walking between and drawing lines and putting up walls and barriers and all sorts of things. Maybe you'd like to play that game, maybe you wouldn't. It's just an exercise in experimenting with empathy and experimenting with game design. And I think it's important to be a little bit sneaky with some of these things. So, and this is something I want to talk about, is that games are, like a lot of art, inherently taking consent away from us. There's been, the last 15, 20 years, we've had a lot of conversations about trigger warning and content warnings, and I think they can be important. I think the term trigger is massively misused because there's a strong difference between something that makes you have a PTSD or panic attack and something that makes you feel uncomfortable. Obviously, it can be a gray area, but we tend to have abused the word trigger, which is actually not helpful for people actually suffering from disabilities. But in theory, there's a good reason when we have a lot of people who are damaged, who are suffering from PTSD, it can be good to have trigger warnings and content warnings on things. I think we tend to overuse them, and I think as we tend to misrepresent what an actual trigger means, and we probably need a different word for it, because we're talking about something that causes a panic reflex, and that's very different than that makes me feel uncomfortable. But art, and particularly games, to some extent cannot be perfectly wrapped and should not be perfectly wrapped. Sometimes games sometimes all art has to take some of that consent away from you. That's what being an audience member means. You are consenting to communication, and that means it might go somewhere uncomfortable. We can use advertising, we can use priming, we can use title and structure and all sorts of things to say, hey, this is basically what this thing is. We don't want a 5-year-old kid expecting Bambi to watch Chainsaw Massacre, but we also have to understand that there is some element of surrender. And that's extra true when it comes to playing games, because games are participatory. And that means you have to step in and take part. And to do that, you have to consent to the mind control of a game. And in that sense, I think it's actually dangerous. Well, no, I think it's actually not useful to make your games very overtly didactic from the first point, because that changes how we participate in things. It changes how we think about an activity. And I've just been working on a game with a friend of mine where he was very keen to go, the point of this game is to tell you this thing, and we're going to tell you this, and we're going to explain exactly how you should do a thing. And I'm like, don't do that. You need to sneak up on people a little bit. And game designers lie a lot about what things are. So I would just play this game and I wouldn't tell anyone about what it was about, because I want them to experience the experience as purely as possible from within themselves. Okay, so they'd be throwing the ball around and getting more and more irritated. And there are lots of things that I've done empathy exercise lists that weren't really games, but were exercises again in understanding other people's points of view. But the best way to enter those things is to enter them without full knowledge of what's going to happen and without full knowledge of what it means, because that's going to change your lens and it's actually going to make you step back. And something that I very much agree with in this book is that there's sympathy and there's empathy. And sympathy tends to be, I'm not that, and I'm feeling that it might be tough for you, but part of my feeling of that is disconnect. It's a sense of I'm removed from it. I can see that would be rough for you, but I'm not you. And sympathy is a very different part of our body than empathy. And empathy often comes from a much more primal and reactive place. In fact, I would sort of say that it comes from a different part of the brain and the nervous system, because sympathy involves imagining ourselves sort of in that position. Empathy doesn't require that. Empathy is, I am in that position. I am feeling those things. I'm trying to pass this football and there's 50 other kids on this field and they're in the way. I'm annoyed. I'm frustrated. I'm wondering why they keep doing this. And that emotion isn't coming from the imagination part of my brain. It's coming from the feeling and reacting part of my brain. In animal control, we actually talk about the reactive nervous system versus the active nervous system. And they're different parts of the brain in an animal. Whether a dog chooses to do something or whether it reacts to a cue is very different for them. And I think that's where we can go with empathy. And we can get there with stories and get there with other things, but empathy through games is very, very strong. And I really agree with Sampat in this book that we can get there without um, priming it about imagination first, because then we can get a visceral, empathetic, this is me reaction. And some of that's through abstract and through participation and through self-insertion, and participation, which we can only get with games. You cannot step into a movie or a book, no matter how much you wish you could. And the book I've just finished writing is actually about this a little bit as well, that games are inherently participatory. And that means we are attracting empathy. And to get that empathy and to get that behavior, sneakiness is a good idea. And that happens both in terms of what story you're telling with the actions, but also it happens to do with it's important not to make it clear that your game is didactic from the first point of view, because that also shifts how we react to things. Didactic things, we tend to step back again and go, oh, you're teaching me something. Okay, I should pay attention. And I'm in this mode of, tell me what it means. I want to know what it means. And that's going to switch off my empathy. It's going to make me into a different role of non-participant, of vessel to be filled up. And I think it's important as game designers to understand that. And all games that are essentially putting us into a student point of view when we learn the rules. And so we want to switch that off somewhat and not go, and you're also going to learn a valuable lesson. And that's also true, of storytelling. We know that kids very quickly understand, like around about the age of 8, when someone is saying, and the moral of the story is, and that it feels false. And this is just also true about all learning. We tend to learn best when we discover meaning ourselves. And that's really also a huge part of all learning. There is a principle of, I can't remember what it's called now. Basically, there's a didactic principle. They've now sort of abandoned it a bit more in education, but 20 years ago it was big, and it'll probably come back again, of letting children and letting students find the answers themselves and doing as little as possible, because when they go off and find the answer, they actually learn a lot more. And so it's possible your game or your work of art is going to be misunderstood. That's worth it for other people to find the meaning. Nobody wants to watch, something and go, oh, yeah, and the director come out and go, that was a lesson about sharing. But if you watch a story and you're hit emotionally, but you think you're just watching a story, and you go, oh, that has made me think a lot about how I act and how I am, then it's just going to be a lot stronger. And that's, again, what games can give you, because games are inherently about participation and they are in a didactic state because you have to learn the rules, but they're in a participatory state in that. You're not just reading the rules. You're going, oh, so if we pull this lever, I should draw a card. If I do this, oh, I get attacked. Okay. If I push that, I jump, and the mushroom's trying to kill me. That is discovery learning, and involves a very different part of our brains, and something that games can do really, really well. So that's, I guess, the message for today. Don't tell people what you're doing with your game. Don't prime them that they should be sympathetic. Don't prime them with narrative if you can avoid it. And don't prime them with the didactic nature. Let emergent play, as they call it, evolve. And make sure you treat your audience like they're smart, because it's fine if they don't find the meaning. For everyone you lose, you'll get someone and they'll find a lot more. So let people explore and present things. I say sneaky, but it's actually more. You're not trying to trick someone so much as you're trying to engage them. And that's the thing, is that a game is also a puzzle. And when you set a puzzle, you aren't trying to block people out. Really, if you set a jigsaw puzzle, you want people to put together. Nobody would like if you made a jigsaw puzzle and everyone went, "Look, this is impossible. There's no way to do this. We cannot make this puzzle." Or if you made a crossword puzzle, or if you made, something, or a board game that only one person could win in the world, nobody would play it. You want these things to be encountered, explored, and mastered. And in that sense, when I say you're being sneaky, what you're actually doing is saying, I've made a treasure hunt for you. I want you to dig and follow and find, because I think that's valuable. I'm not saying, find the hidden meaning and you'll be clever. I'm saying, I want to play with you. And that, I think, is also really important, that when game designers make games, we are, in a sense, playing a game, because games are about sharing. They're about sharing an experience with another person, even a solo game, because the designer is saying, see what you do with this. Here is some rules and some materials that I want you to interact with. You can design a game that only you play. You absolutely can. But as a game designer, I've done that, and it doesn't feel like a game. A game requires, at very least, an audience or a player that isn't you, and that itself is a game, a sharing exercise where you say to people, here is a thing, I want you to interact with it. And so when I say sneaky, what I actually mean is engaging. I want you to engage with this, and I want to see what happens. And if I just tell you what to do, I'm not actually engaging you. So don't say, sit there and talk to each other, and it's a social game. Give people something to talk about, and they will talk. I want to keep all these under 30 minutes, so I'm going to sign off there. Thank you for watching. If you did watch, I'm sure hardly any of you did, but otherwise, we'll see you next week for another blog somewhere in the middle of the week. I've been Steve D. I make games at Tinstar Games. I'll put a link to the book in the show notes. I'll see you next week. Don't stay up all night watching scary movies.